What's up, geeks and gamers? It's Odin coming back with a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, and yes, that title is still a mouthful, get to a 5-day total of around $80 million domestically. Of course, Tony over at Deadline's running with it being a record. Now, of course, we all know that Tony and most of the people at Deadline and the mainstream media don't account for things like inflation or ticket prices changing over time as well, and so whether or not this is honestly as good as what he might be trying to paint this to be, the fact is that this movie is definitely not in a position where it's doing poorly. Like, some people, I think, are honestly looking at the amount of money that this movie has made so far and have been making certain assumptions saying, okay, well, this is where people thought the film was going to be. Here's what it actually is. That makes it a failure. But you have to remember that the way that these kinds of movies, the ones that don't have the massive opening weekends compared to some of the old school Marvel films or some of the other big films from the from the past few years, which again are few and far between, but those films that have a very positive word of mouth, that have a lot of positivity around it, end up doing very, very well down the road, right? People seem to be forgetting that Despicable Me, for instance, Despicable Me, the one that came out last year, it was Minions: Rise of Gru. Minions: Rise of Gru opened up to around $220 million worldwide and was still able to make well north of $900 million when everything was said and done. Top Gun: Maverick last year opened to around $250 million before going on to make well over $1 billion. And though I think that the chances of this film making $1 billion are still not guaranteed, I still do think that the likelihood of it happening, based on the numbers that we're seeing, we'll have to wait for those week 2 drop-offs to know for sure, still makes it a possibility for this movie. So we'll dive into that. We'll also dive into how Tony is continuing to fail at coping with the fact that Sound of Freedom is really the big story of this weekend, because though it's awesome that Mission Impossible is doing great because it's a fantastic movie, it's a lot of fun, there's no agenda within it, which is great, but also you have Sound of Freedom, which does have an agenda, and it's an agenda that every single person who has a brain, who has a soul, should get behind. And the fact that there are still people in the media today that are still refusing to get behind the message of that movie, which is to stop the trafficking of innocent children, You would think that would be something that could unite everybody together, but unfortunately, people like Tony and many others in the media want to continue to try to pretend like this is somehow a miraculous occurrence, that somehow it's amazing that this is all happening. How could a movie like this do as well as it is? And it comes down to a few things. One, it's because the movie is talking about something real, which is something that most movies today do not actually talk about. Two, the mainstream media and Hollywood have been against this movie from essentially the get-go. Yes, you can argue, well, the movie was made by mainstream Hollywood back in the day, 5 years ago, and this movie would have been coming out under different circumstances had Angel Studios not bought the distribution rights to it. But that is just kind of the point. The movie was made 5 years ago, sat on, and then once you had the Disney deal go through, Disney sat on it before selling it eventually to Angel Studios, who, after having to jump through other hoops, were able to finally get this film into distribution. And despite all of those efforts, despite every single attempt to try to keep the movie from the public eye and to keep people from actually going to see it, support it, to understand what the messaging is about, guess what? People are fed up with it. We live in a very different world today where people have access to information, have access to truth in a way that was never seen before. No longer do they have to rely upon the mainstream media, who's going to constantly lie to them about a myriad of other things to be able to find out exactly what a movie is about, but also the people behind said movie, right? There's always been, especially from the beginning of this film being released, this talk about certain conspiracy theories, which, again, turns out are not really present in this movie, let alone are not conspiracy theories. Again, if you're going to try and say that what's covered in that movie is somehow a conspiracy or not real, I'm sorry, but you are beyond help at this point. No one can, if you can't be convinced of truth, again, I honestly don't know what will actually help you. Let's go ahead and dive into these numbers. First, going on to Deadline says, facts are facts. Really, Tony? You're going to start off with that? You certainly love to play with the facts, don't you? And Paramount Skydance Mission Impossible set a 5-day opening domestic record for the franchise with $80 million. Paramount is calling the global opening here at $235 million. Read Nancy's report here. Oh, look at that, Nancy! You're back in the play. Glad to see you here, Nance. Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny only opened to $130 million. And here's the other factor that you gotta be kind of focusing a little bit more attention on there, Tony. Not only did Indiana Jones open to $100 million less than what Dead Reckoning Part 1 opened to, but it also is being incredibly universally praised. Are there going to be critics out there? Are there going to be certain things you can point to in the movie that are not perfect? Absolutely. It is a movie. That is kind of the nature of the beast. But on paper, you cannot, even if you hate this movie, you cannot deny the fact that this movie has universal praise. That the vast majority of people coming out of the film not only really like the film, but love the film. And love the film so much that they want other people to go out and see it. That's why you're seeing such high percentages of people saying this is a must-see movie and this is a must-see in theaters movie. And so that is something that Dial of Destiny never had at any point during any of its run. And so to say and try to make the comparisons there, or trying to, again, leave that part out of the discussion, I think is a little bit disingenuous, because as we all know, this movie is not only a huge, much bigger film, much bigger win for Dead Reckoning Part 1 over Dial of Destiny, but it also showcases why this film likely has a lot better legs. And let's just be fair, this movie is going to easily pass whatever Dial of Destiny hopes to get in the long run. Asserted Paramount Domestic Distribution President Chris Aronson this morning, Mission is a global story, has always been a global story, and will continue to be a global story. And that's why it will do well in the domestic market and do even better internationally. The last few movies especially have each made about 2.5 times what they made domestically in the international markets. We suspect, based on the numbers that we're seeing right now, that is probably going to happen again. But to me, I think the most impressive thing about this movie, and something that a lot of people who've been saying this film's not doing very well, again, in comparison to the projections, yes, this film is not doing well compared to the projections. But if you take for a moment to think about, wait a minute, this is a 5-day opening over a non-holiday frame. You don't get a lot of those, right? And when you actually compare the numbers to the previous movies, when you compare this film to the previous Mission Impossible films, you actually start to see the trend that this movie is right up there. This movie is performing about as well as any of the previous films that have been released. And you also have to take into account the fact that it did get a weird release, right? You had some early showings the Sunday before its opening weekend. I was able to go to a Monday showing, right? And all of these are factors that have to be brought into the discussion when talking about the long-term legs of this movie, because what have we seen? The movie has been doing very well as far as the reactions, and we all know reactions, word of mouth, are key, especially in today's market, more so than ever before. We did, of course, mention the fact that Nance is back. Nance, what's going on? You're done hiding from me now? Says Dead Reckoning Part 1 lights a fuse with $235 million global opening. Now, again, compared to what was projected, $250 million, this is below. But the reason why this film is different, right? Some people say, wait a minute, you didn't make the same excuse for Disney this or Disney that. The problem, though, with those movies is that the Disney releases did not have the same positive word of mouth. And that is a huge difference, right? If you're coming in underneath projections because, hey, there are not a lot of 5-day openings with non-holidays to be able to compare a film to get your projections in the right ballpark, you have to understand, right, that is going to have to be a factor that is taken in. Whereas in the case of many of these Disney movies, they have histories, they have records, right? You can go back and look at a typical 3-day opening for a movie and say, this film is not up to standard. This film is not up to standard here or there. And so you have to recognize that there is a clear difference between those two things. And so $235 million, though it's underneath the $250 million, it's still on its own face pretty good. Again, Minions Rise of Gru last year opened at 220. That film ended north of $900 million. This movie, $235 million compared to Top Gun Maverick's $250 million global opening last year. Again, those are all factors. Now, do I think this film's going to do as well as Maverick? No, I think there are a couple factors that are going to hold it back. The runtime is a huge part of that. It means less showings, less showtimes, and that almost always, not always, but almost always hurts movies like this in the long term, in the long run, but it's still going to do very, very well regardless of any of that. Let's go ahead and then dive into the numbers over at thenumbers.com. Again, a $56 million 3-day domestic. So if you're wondering why does it say 80 versus 56, 80 is what it's made so far since it opened on that, again, Monday, Tuesday, whereas the 56.2 is what it made from a Friday to Sunday frame. And so again, when you compare this out to the other Mission Impossible films, again, the lowest of the recent modern era was around $60 million or so, a little over 60. So this is at 56 and it had a weird opening. That actually would therefore put this around the same mark, right? Would make this essentially right up there. It's not coming in underneath what the typical audience going to see this movie opening weekend is. And I think because of the positive word of mouth, we'll probably end up seeing very similar numbers for those other movies where you had very strong holds from week to week. And ultimately that means that I think this movie is definitely going to make a lot of money. Whether it makes $1 billion or not is still up in the air. This film does have to make quite a bit though. At a $290 million budget, the film needs to make roughly $900 million or so, some would have, to break even. I had the break even a little bit underneath where that would be, and I think that's going to easily pass the more conservative break even point. The fact, though, is I do think that this movie is still going to be able to do very, very well. And even if it's only slightly higher than what you saw with the Minions Rise of Gru, I do think that the adult audiences who are enjoying this movie are going to continue to show up in droves. But the most impressive story, I think, right now going on at the box office, as excited as I am for Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, is Sound of Freedom. What Sound of Freedom has done with all the animosity, with all the controversy surrounding the film, again, all artificially created by the media, by the way, the movie is still doing well. Never have I seen right? When it comes to these films that have, a wide release, right? Coming here domestically at the very least, like coming out at well over 2,500 screens, I would say is a typical wide release in today's market. The fact that this film has since seen a 300 screen increase, has also now opened at over 3,200 screens, and then saw a 37% increase from its official opening weekend, that is impressive. Look at that per theater ratio. It made $8,200 per screen. That's almost double brand new film Insidious: The Red Door, Sony, giant machine behind it. It of course, completely destroys Dial of Destiny, 3,100 screens, which, again, it's now actually 3,100 as far as per theater ratio, losing over 700 screens after only 3 weeks. What that means is that Sound of Freedom is on the way to easily passing $100 million domestic. That is essentially a guarantee. Unless they were to pull it from all screens, it's not going to miss that. So we're talking well north of $100 million by the end of it. You actually have a scenario where Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny's 145 could eventually be overtaken by Sound of Freedom. That is the kind of numbers that we're seeing for this movie and the level of support. And of course, Tony is going to only spend just a little bit of time talking about that in his domestic article. Isn't it amazing? If you go back and you look at all of his articles, how much time, how much ink he spends on almost every other film, especially if it's the number 2 film and it's only been out for 2 weeks, right? Remember how he's done that for almost every single film in that way? Look at how much time he spends on Sound of Freedom. That's it. Right there. And what does he say? He says, again, interestingly enough, he's not talking here about or mentioning anything about conservative right-wing agendas, interestingly enough. It says, also faring extremely well here is Angel Studios' anti-child trafficking thriller. Is there any other kind of movie, Tony? I have an honest question there, right? Is there any other position to be on? Go see this film. Go support it. Seriously. Wizard Distribution is calling at a 27 million second weekend. In second place, up a humongous 37%. He said humongo. I just cannot say that in all seriousness in a, again, serious statement. When does that ever happen? That's a great question, Tony. When does it ever happen? And why are you spending so little time trying to talk about it and break it down is the bigger question. For a running total north of 85 million, this Jim Caviezel movie is going well north of $100 million in the next week. Yeah, not only is it going to guarantee to pass $100 million, in the next week alone, before next weekend, it's going to cross $100 million, and that is incredibly impressive no matter which way you actually look at it. Mission Impossible Worldwide, again, the numbers right now is saying 216.9, but we know based on the reports that it's actually closer to 235, so I imagine the numbers will probably update over the course of the, again, recording of this video, or by the time this video goes live. 85 million for Sound of Freedom is darn impressive, and I heard recently that they are going to have some kind of international release on this movie. Again, it is going to get a release in other countries. I don't know which ones for sure, but again, that is just going to help the overall prospects for this film. Insidious: Red Door, $222.5 million for its budget. Again, it broke even opening weekend. It's just adding on to it. I'm not a fan of the franchise, but if you are, you should be happy. Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny did indeed cross $30 million, as I suspected that it would, but really this film is done making any major bucks. And again, this film already said to be probably the biggest flop of the year. Elemental has actually seen a little bit of life down the stretch. It's actually well outperformed the first 2 weeks of its initial release. So this film is officially a chart breaker on my charting, doing much better compared to its first 2 weeks based on the trends that we were actually seeing early on. So hey, kudos to them for being able to do that. However, the film still cost quite a bit of money, and they are still a far cry from ever hoping to break even on it. Spider-Verse is still marching probably towards a $700 to $750 million end. Again, 750 would be a little bit out there, but 700 I would say is probably a good stopping point for where that movie will end up. Rise of the Beast at $420 million. Again, still doing better than what had been expected, but still a little bit away from where it needs to break even. No Hard Feelings, same thing. The Joyride film, still no budget. Interesting that they're not reporting a budget on this epic failure of a movie, which Mr. John Campea himself said was the funniest movie he's ever seen in like forever. Little Mermaid, $546 million, again, doing better than what had been expected, but because this film cost $250 million to make, it is still a far cry from where it needs to actually make any money, and so you're still looking at this film being probably around a $100 million flop when we get those numbers in the next coming months and probably over the course of the next year, if we get any updated budgets. As we know, Disney has been overspending on their budgets. Ruby Gillman Teenage Kraken also continues to be a flop. However, again, because of the way Netflix was able to spend, was able basically to pay for this movie, The studio is not actually going to see a net loss on that film. The Flash also continues to be a massive disappointment, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is probably not going to get to 850, but has still a chance. It's still out there in theaters. It's still making some money, but we'll have to wait and see. And of course, I don't know if there's any updated numbers on other sites that might be having this number higher. Box Office Mojo tends to have a higher number, but it's still too early to tell. Looking at the box office charting, we love to do charting here at Geeks and Gamers as we wrap this video up with a $235 million opening weekend. Again, using that typical standard that I have used in previous videos, and also in previous breakdowns, talking about how most films tend to, again, on average, if it's an average release, meaning it has typical drops, and I think that we could all admit that, hey, the word of mouth on this movie likely means we're not going to see typical drops. We're probably going to see some pretty strong holds. Even with a typical drop, you would still see this film get north of $700 million. Now, because we know, based off of how people are responding, we won't know for sure until we get those next weekend, second weekend numbers. But if it indeed has the type of strong hold that I think that it will, right, 50% or less compared to the previous weekend, then I do think that we could end up seeing this movie, again, outperform in so many ways the typical movie that we see in modern day. Having a performance similar to that of a Top Gun Maverick, though I think maybe slightly less, and not merely doing as well domestically, especially, whereas the international might be where this film really ends up shining because it is doing very well in those different markets. Right now I have the break even set at 725. Again, some people might have the break even closer to 3 times the budget, which would be closer to 900 million. Either way, I think that it will definitely be able to hit that mark. We have to, of course, just wait and see. Joyride is, again, likely a flop, but we don't have a budget, so we can't say for sure. Sound of Freedom is nothing but a huge win for Angel Studio. Again, shout out to them for picking up this movie and actually putting it out in theaters. And hey, media can't hide from this film at all. Insidious 5 continuing to add to its profits. Ruby Gillman, again, a loss, but the studio won't actually lose because of how Netflix paid for it. Indiana Jones is still a massive $268 million flop as of the recording of this video. Some might have that as a higher number. And again, this is based off of what they told us was $300 million. But there's now some that are actually saying this is number that's actually between 350 and 400 million. Maybe that could even be a low end. So let's just say this film is going to be the biggest box office flop of the year. If you want any other updates, you can go ahead and check out the chart over at ombreviews.com. I will, of course, have my box office breakdown maybe up before this video, as this video has been kind of being pushed to, I think, releasing on Mondays and stuff. So it is Monday recording this video. I am recording this on Sunday afternoon. So what are y'all's thoughts about this? Do you think that Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 is going to have the type of legs that we've seen from films like, again, the one that I typically bring up because it's another Tom Cruise film, Top Gun Maverick? Again, I don't think it's going to have the same box office, but I do think that where it maybe fails in comparison to Maverick in the domestic market, I think it might make up for internationally. Still hard to say. It's too early to tell. That second weekend drop-off will tell us a lot. But for anyone to say this movie's not doing well, again, you can only say that if you're comparing it to the projections. If you're actually looking at this historically, if you're looking at what typical 5-day openings for non-holiday frames are, and you especially compare this to the openings of the previous Mission Impossible movies, especially of more recent times, this film is doing just fine. It's doing exactly what it needs to, and right now there has not been any indication that the film is not doing well. It's just been a bunch of people who have been making projections that have not been able to really put any type of feelers on this movie in a very accurate way because, again, there's no real good standard to compare it to. But let me know your thoughts about this in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button. Whatever it is that you're watching, smash it. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.